The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Florentine palazzo as contemplated the letter that had just arrived from Rome. The parchment bore the papal seal, yet its contents promised neither salvation nor damnation, only the cold reality of political necessity. As he set the document aside and gazed into the flickering candlelight, recalled the words of the exiled secretary who had once served the Republic. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. His observations on power had not merely been academic musings. They were the distilled essence of centuries of human ambition, betrayal, and survival in the ruthless theater of politics. The truth that understood, and that now faced in his own rise to prominence, was that authority demanded a particular kind of psychological constitution, one that few possessed and fewer still could maintain without losing either their sanity or their soul. Power, as observed through his careful study of princes, republics, and empires, was not simply about commanding others or accumulating wealth. It was about understanding the fundamental darkness that lurked within human nature and being willing to dance with that darkness when circumstances demanded it. Had witnessed this firsthand during his apprenticeship under Cardinal, whose name had become synonymous with the calculated ruthlessness that defined Renaissance politics. The Cardinal had taken under his wing not out of kindness, but because he recognized in the young man a quality that set him apart from the idealistic courtiers who surrounded them. Where others spoke of honor and virtue in the abstract, understood that these concepts existed in a constant tension with the practical demands of maintaining power. The Cardinal had tested this understanding repeatedly, presenting with choices that forced him to weigh moral considerations against political necessity. The vulgar crowd is attracted by appearances and results, had written, and had seen the truth of this observation in countless political maneuvers. The people who cheered for their leaders during times of prosperity would just as quickly turn against them when fortune shifted. This fickleness was not a flaw in human nature, it was simply its reality. Those who sought to wield authority effectively had to account for this fundamental instability in human loyalty and affection. The first insight that separated true wielders of power from mere pretenders was the recognition that love and fear operated according to different psychological mechanisms. Love, had noted, was held by a chain of obligation that could be broken whenever it served the self-interest of the one who had promised it. Fear, however, was maintained by a dread of punishment that never left those who were subject to it. This was not a prescription for tyranny, but rather a cold assessment of human psychology under pressure. Remembered the crisis that had erupted 3 years earlier, when the city faced both external military threats and internal rebellion. The previous ruler had attempted to govern through benevolence alone, believing that his genuine care for the people's welfare would inspire their loyalty and cooperation. When the crisis struck, however, that same population had not hesitated to abandon him the moment his ability to protect them came into question. The lesson was clear. Good intentions without the backing of respected strength created not lasting peace but eventual chaos. The replacement of that well-meaning but ineffective ruler had not been accomplished through violence or conspiracy, but through a carefully orchestrated demonstration of competence during the crisis. Had emerged as the natural choice not because he promised more kindness than his predecessor, but because he demonstrated the capacity to make difficult decisions quickly and effectively. The population, faced with immediate threats, had chosen security over sentiment, exactly as analysis would have predicted. This transition had taught another crucial insight from Machiavellian thought, the importance of appearing to embody virtues while retaining the flexibility to act against them when necessary. The successful exercise of authority required what termed the knowledge of how to use both the beast and the man. This meant understanding when to employ force, and when to use reason, when to keep promises, and when to break them, when to show mercy, and when to demonstrate severity. The art of this balance was perhaps the most psychologically demanding aspect of wielding power. It required a leader to maintain multiple, sometimes contradictory personas simultaneously. In public, had to project confidence, wisdom, and moral certainty. In private councils, he needed to demonstrate pragmatic flexibility and strategic thinking. In moments of crisis, he had to be prepared to act with swift decisiveness, even when the available options were all morally ambiguous. Most people, had observed, could not sustain this psychological complexity. They either became paralyzed by the contradictions or resolved them by adopting a single, consistent approach that left them vulnerable to circumstances that required different responses. The former group was eliminated by more decisive rivals. The latter group was eventually destroyed by their own inflexibility when situations arose that their chosen approach could not address. The second major insight that distinguished effective wielders of power was the understanding that perception often mattered more than reality in political affairs. Had observed that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. This was not an encouragement to engage in deception for its own sake, but rather a recognition that political effectiveness required careful attention to how actions would be interpreted by different audiences. Had learned this lesson during his first major military campaign, when he had been forced to make a strategic retreat that, while militarily sound, could easily have been interpreted as cowardice or incompetence. Rather than simply hoping that people would understand the tactical necessity of the withdrawal, he had carefully managed the narrative surrounding the decision. He ensured that key supporters understood the strategic logic, that the general population received information that emphasized the preservation of their soldiers' lives, and that potential enemies received signals that the retreat was a temporary strategic repositioning rather than an indication of weakness. The campaign's ultimate success validated the tactical decision, but understood that without careful management of perceptions, the initial retreat could have undermined his authority regardless of the final outcome. This taught him that effective leadership required not only making good decisions, but also ensuring that those decisions were understood and interpreted in ways that supported rather than undermined his position. This attention to perception extended beyond major policy decisions to encompass every aspect of public presentation. Had emphasized the importance of avoiding contempt and hatred, noting that a ruler could survive being feared but not being despised. Had observed how previous leaders had fallen into contempt not necessarily because of their policies, but because of their presentation. A leader who appeared indecisive, weak, or overly influenced by advisors would lose authority even if their actual decisions were sound. The psychological challenge of managing perceptions was that it required a constant awareness of how one's actions would be interpreted by multiple audiences with different interests and biases. What appeared as necessary firmness to supporters might seem like cruelty to opponents. What demonstrated flexibility to some could be seen as inconsistency by others. The successful wielder of authority had to develop an intuitive sense of how to navigate these competing interpretations while maintaining a coherent public image. Had also learned that the management of perceptions extended to the careful cultivation of both reputation and relationships. Had noted that a prince's reputation was one of his most valuable assets, but that reputation had to be based on demonstrated competence rather than merely claimed virtue. This meant that every public action had to be evaluated not only for its immediate practical effects, but also for its impact on long-term credibility. The cultivation of relationships presented another layer of complexity. Effective authority required building networks of support that could provide both information and assistance during crises. However, these relationships had to be managed carefully to avoid creating dependencies that could be exploited by enemies or obligations that could constrain decision-making freedom. Had warned against both isolation and excessive reliance on others, advocating instead for a strategic approach to alliance building that maintained flexibility while ensuring access to necessary resources. The third crucial insight from Machiavellian analysis was the recognition that authority existed in a constant state of tension between stability and change. Those who wielded power effectively had to be prepared for the inevitable shifts in fortune that characterized political life, while working to create institutions and relationships that could provide some measure of continuity through those changes. Had experienced this tension most acutely during the period when external threats had forced him to consider forming an alliance with traditional enemies while potentially betraying long-standing allies. The decision had required him to weigh immediate survival against long-term strategic positioning, short-term betrayal against long-term loyalty, and present necessity against future consequences. The complexity of these calculations had nearly overwhelmed him, and he had begun to understand why he had written about the loneliness of command. The isolation that accompanied effective leadership was perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of wielding authority. The need to maintain strategic flexibility meant that a leader could not afford to become too closely identified with any particular faction or ideology. The requirement to make decisions based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes meant that a leader could not seek comfort in the certainty that others might find in simpler roles. The responsibility for consequences that affected many people's lives meant that a leader carried burdens that could not be shared or delegated. Had understood this isolation and had written about it with a combination of sympathy and stark realism. The effective ruler, he observed, had to be prepared to act alone when necessary, to make decisions that others would criticize, and to bear responsibility for outcomes that were influenced by forces beyond any individual's control. This was not a consequence of poor leadership or personal failing. It was an inherent feature of the role itself. Had found that this isolation was compounded by the fact that those around him could never be entirely sure of his true thoughts or intentions. The strategic ambiguity that was necessary for maintaining flexibility in a complex political environment meant that even close advisors could not be given complete information about his reasoning or plans. This created a barrier between him and others that existed regardless of personal affection or trust. The psychological toll of maintaining this isolation while carrying the responsibility for others' welfare had led to understand another dimension of insights: the importance of developing internal sources of strength and validation that did not depend on external approval or affection. The effective wielder of authority had to find satisfaction in the successful completion of necessary tasks rather than in the gratitude or admiration of those who benefited from that success. This internal orientation required a fundamental shift in how one evaluated success and failure. Instead of measuring achievement by popularity or immediate approval, the effective leader had to develop metrics based on long-term stability, institutional health, and the general welfare of those under their authority. This shift was difficult because it ran counter to normal human desires for acceptance and appreciation. But it was necessary for maintaining the psychological equilibrium required to make difficult decisions consistently over time. The development of this internal orientation was complicated by the fact that it had to coexist with acute sensitivity to external political currents and popular opinion. The leader had to remain detached enough from immediate approval to make unpopular but necessary decisions, while remaining connected enough to public sentiment to avoid losing touch with the concerns and needs of those they served. This balance required a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics that went beyond simple rules or formulas. Had also discovered that effective authority required a particular relationship with time and patience that distinguished successful leaders from those who were ultimately defeated by circumstances. Had written about the importance of timing in political action, noting that the same decision could be brilliant or disastrous, depending on when it was implemented. This meant that wielding authority effectively required not only knowing what to do, but also when to do it, and perhaps more importantly, when not to do it. The cultivation of this sense of timing had required to develop an almost philosophical relationship with uncertainty and delay. In a world where immediate action was often demanded by circumstances or supporters, the effective leader had to be prepared to wait for the right moment even when that patience was criticized as indecision or weakness. Conversely, when the moment for action arrived, it required the ability to move decisively even when others counseled more deliberation. This relationship with timing extended to the management of both opportunities and threats. Had observed that fortune favored the bold, but also that rash action could be as dangerous as excessive caution. The skill lay in distinguishing between situations that required immediate bold action and those that demanded patient preparation. Had learned that this distinction could rarely be made through abstract analysis. It required an intuitive understanding of the specific dynamics at play in each situation. The development of this intuitive judgment had been one of the most challenging aspects of his evolution as a leader. Unlike technical skills that could be learned through study and practice, the ability to read complex political situations and choose appropriate responses seemed to require a combination of experience, natural aptitude, and psychological resilience that could not be easily acquired or taught. As reflected on these insights while the rain continued to fall outside his window, he understood that he had been changed fundamentally by his experience with authority. The person who had first accepted responsibility for others' welfare had been motivated by idealistic notions of service and justice. The leader he had become was motivated by a more complex understanding of human nature and social dynamics, that incorporated those ideals while acknowledging the limitations and contradictions that constrained their implementation. This transformation had not been a corruption or betrayal of his original values, but rather their refinement through contact with reality. He still desired justice and prosperity for those under his authority, but he now understood that achieving those goals required methods and compromises that his younger self would have found morally problematic. The recognition that good intentions alone were insufficient for producing good outcomes had forced him to develop a more sophisticated ethical framework that could accommodate the complexities of political action. The loneliness that had identified as an inevitable accompaniment to power had become a familiar presence in his life, but he had learned to see it not as a burden, but as a necessary condition for maintaining the psychological independence required for effective decision-making. The distance that authority created between him and others was not a personal failing, but a structural feature of the role he had accepted. Perhaps most importantly, had come to understand that the psychological demands of wielding authority effectively were not temporary challenges to be overcome, but permanent features of the role that had to be managed continuously. There was no point at which a leader could relax into certainty or safety. The need for vigilance, flexibility, and psychological resilience was constant. This was why, as had observed, few could handle this kind of authority, not because it required rare talents or exceptional intelligence, but because it demanded a psychological constitution that most people were either unwilling or unable to develop and maintain. The papal letter that had prompted his evening reflections contained a proposal that would test all of these insights once again. The Pope was suggesting an alliance that would provide significant advantages, but would also require to betray commitments he had made to other allies. The decision would have to be made quickly, with incomplete information about the Pope's true intentions and uncertain knowledge about how other powers would respond. As he considered his options, found himself applying the analytical framework that his experience with Machiavellian insights had taught him. He evaluated the proposal not primarily in terms of abstract moral principles, but in terms of its likely consequences for the stability and prosperity of those under his authority. He considered not only the immediate advantages and disadvantages, but also the long-term implications for his reputation and relationships. He weighed the risks of action against the risks of inaction, understanding that both choices carried potentially serious consequences. The decision-making process itself had become second nature to him, but he remained acutely aware of its psychological costs. Each major decision required him to accept responsibility for outcomes that would affect many people's lives, while acknowledging that those outcomes would be influenced by factors beyond his control. Each choice required him to balance competing values and interests, while knowing that any decision would disappoint some constituencies and create new vulnerabilities. Yet it also learned to find satisfaction in this process despite its difficulties. The successful navigation of complex political challenges provided a form of fulfillment that was different from, but no less real than the simpler satisfactions available to those who did not bear such responsibilities. The knowledge that his decisions contributed to the welfare and security of others, even when those others could not fully understand or appreciate the complexities involved, provided a sense of purpose that sustained him through the isolation and uncertainty. The cultivation of this sense of purpose had required to develop what might be called a tragic understanding of leadership, an acceptance that the exercise of authority necessarily involved moral ambiguity, unintended consequences, and personal sacrifice, but that these costs were justified by the alternative of allowing circumstances to develop without intelligent guidance. This was not cynicism or nihilism, but rather a mature recognition of the limitations within which human action necessarily occurred. This tragic understanding had also led to appreciate another dimension of analysis, the recognition that political action took place within historical contexts that constrained available options while creating opportunities for those skilled enough to recognize and exploit them. The effective leader was not one who imposed his will upon circumstances through force alone, but one who understood the historical currents at work and positioned himself to channel those currents toward beneficial outcomes. This historical perspective had helped understand that his own exercise of authority was part of a larger pattern of human political development that extended far beyond his personal ambitions or immediate circumstances. The challenges he faced were not unique to his time or place, but reflected permanent features of human social organization that had challenged leaders throughout history. This recognition provided a form of consolation for the difficulties of his position, while also emphasizing the importance of learning from the successes and failures of previous generations. The study of history had also taught to appreciate the complexity of judging political action across time. Leaders who had been reviled by their contemporaries were sometimes vindicated by later generations who could see the long-term consequences of their decisions. Conversely, leaders who had been popular in their own time were sometimes criticized by historians who could identify the hidden costs or unintended consequences of their policies. This historical perspective reinforced the importance of making decisions based on careful analysis of likely consequences rather than on immediate popular approval. As the night deepened and the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, found himself thinking about the young men and women who sought his guidance about entering political life. They came to him with idealistic visions of public service and social reform, much as he had once approached his own entry into positions of responsibility. He understood their motivations and respected their intentions, but he also knew that most of them would not survive the psychological demands that effective authority required. The few who did survive would be changed by the experience in ways they could not currently imagine. They would learn to navigate moral ambiguity without losing their essential humanity. They would develop the capacity to make decisions with incomplete information while accepting responsibility for the consequences. They would cultivate the psychological resilience necessary to withstand criticism, betrayal, and the inevitable reversals of political fortune. Most importantly, they would come to understand that the exercise of authority was not primarily about personal advancement or the implementation of preferred policies, but about the assumption of responsibility for outcomes that affected others' lives. This responsibility could not be delegated or avoided. It had to be accepted fully along with all its psychological and moral implications. Had learned to see this acceptance of responsibility as both the burden and the privilege of leadership. It was a burden because it required constant vigilance, difficult decisions, and personal sacrifice. It was a privilege because it provided opportunities to influence the course of events in ways that could benefit many people across extended periods of time. The tension between these two aspects of authority was never fully resolved, but it could be managed by those who understood its nature and were prepared to live with its implications. The papal letter remained on his desk, awaiting a response that would demonstrate once again whether he had truly mastered the insights that had identified as essential for those who would wield power effectively. As prepared to draft his reply, he reflected on the irony that the greatest political philosopher of the Renaissance had spent his later years in exile, excluded from the very political processes he had analyzed so brilliantly. Perhaps this exclusion had been necessary for the development of his insights. The distance from immediate political pressures had allowed him to see patterns and principles that might have been obscured by the demands of day-to-day governance. It also understood that theoretical insights required practical application to achieve their full value. The analysis of power relationships and political dynamics was valuable, but it had to be translated into specific decisions and actions within particular historical contexts. This translation process required not only intellectual understanding, but also the psychological capacity to act upon that understanding despite uncertainty, opposition, and personal cost. The combination of theoretical insight and practical capability that effective authority required was rare not because it demanded extraordinary intelligence, but because it required a form of psychological integration that few people achieved. Most individuals operated comfortably within limited spheres of responsibility where moral choices were relatively clear and consequences were predictable. The expansion of authority beyond these comfortable boundaries forced leaders to confront the fundamental ambiguities and contradictions of human existence in ways that many found overwhelming. Had survived this confrontation and had learned to operate effectively within these ambiguities, but he remained aware that his psychological equilibrium was maintained through constant effort rather than achieved through permanent resolution. Each new challenge required him to reapply the insights he had internalized while adapting them to circumstances that were never quite identical to those he had faced before. The letter from Rome represented another such challenge, one that would test his ability to balance competing loyalties, assess incomplete information, and accept responsibility for consequences that would unfold over months or years. The decision he made would become part of his historical legacy, but more importantly, it would affect the lives and welfare of the people who looked to him for leadership and protection. As he finally took up his pen to begin drafting a response, understood that he was not merely answering a diplomatic communication, but participating in the eternal human struggle to exercise power wisely despite its inherent moral complexities and psychological demands. The insights that had crystallized through his analysis of Renaissance politics remained relevant because they addressed permanent features of human nature and social organization that transcended specific historical periods. The few who could handle this kind of authority were those who had learned to embrace these permanent challenges rather than being defeated by them. They understood that effective leadership required not the resolution of fundamental tensions, but the skillful management of those tensions in service of larger purposes. They accepted the loneliness, moral ambiguity, and personal risk that authority entailed while finding meaning in the opportunity to influence events in ways that served the common good. In the end, reflected as he began to write, the coldest of insights was perhaps also the most hopeful. That despite all the limitations and corruptions that seemed to attend the exercise of power, there remained the possibility that skilled and dedicated individuals could learn to wield authority in ways that advanced human flourishing. The tragedy of politics was not that power inevitably corrupted those who wielded it, but that so few were willing or able to develop the psychological resources necessary to wield it well. The rain had stopped, and the first light of dawn was beginning to appear beyond the windows as completed his letter to Rome. His decision had been made through the application of principles that had identified centuries earlier, but the specific choice reflected the unique circumstances of his own time and the particular responsibilities he had accepted. The response he sent would initiate a new phase of political maneuvering, whose consequences would unfold according to patterns that the great Florentine theorist had analyzed, but whose specific outcomes would depend on the skill, wisdom, and psychological resilience of all the players involved. As sealed the letter and prepared it for dispatch, he understood that he had once again demonstrated his capacity to handle the kind of authority that few could manage effectively. The demonstration was not a cause for pride or self-congratulation, but simply a confirmation that he remained capable of fulfilling the responsibilities he had accepted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges that would test these capabilities once again, continuing the eternal cycle through which human societies were governed, protected, and occasionally advanced through the efforts of those rare individuals who could master both the theory and practice of political power. The document that had arrived with such dramatic timing the previous evening would soon be forgotten, replaced by newer crises and opportunities that would demand the same careful analysis and decisive action. But the insights that had guided its response, insights that had distilled from his observation of human nature under the pressures of political responsibility, would remain relevant as long as human beings continued to organize themselves into societies that required governance, protection, and leadership. In this continuity lay both the burden and the consolation of those who accepted the challenges of authority, the recognition that their struggles were part of a larger human story that extended far beyond their individual lives, but also that their contributions to that story could influence its direction in ways that served the welfare of countless others across extended periods of time. Few could handle this kind of authority, but for those who could, the handling of it provided both the greatest challenges and the most meaningful opportunities that human life afforded.